11,600 years ago, something erased an entire civilization from existence. 400 feet of ocean swallowed their cities. Their story survived as myth. We call it Atlantis. But what if it was real? Beneath the silt of forgotten oceans, fragments of geometry whisper the story of a world erased. To remember Atlantis is to remember ourselves. The builders, the dreamers, the ones who vanished beneath the tide. For more than 2,000 years, we've dismissed Plato's account of Atlantis as allegory, as moral fable, as philosophical fantasy. Mainstream archaeology insists there's no evidence, no ruins, no artifacts, no proof. And yet, when you look beyond the comfortable boundaries of accepted history, when you allow yourself to question what we've been taught, something extraordinary emerges. Not fantasy, not allegory, but fragments of a real catastrophe that reshaped our world and nearly erased humanity itself. I've spent decades investigating the possibility of a lost civilization, destroyed at the end of the last ice age. What I've discovered isn't just about one sunken island in the Atlantic. It's about a global cataclysm so devastating that it became encoded in the myths and legends of every culture on Earth. The story of Atlantis, I believe, is the story of that cataclysm, a real memory of something terrible that happened to our ancestors 11,600 years ago. Let's start where Plato started. Around 360 BC, the Greek philosopher wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, describing a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time. According to Plato, the story came from Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker who heard it from Egyptian priests during his travels to Sais. These priests spoke of a vast island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, home to an advanced maritime civilization that ruled much of the known world. Then, in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, Atlantis vanished beneath the waves, and with it, the armies that had threatened the ancient Mediterranean world. Mainstream scholars call it mythology, a cautionary tale about hubris and divine punishment, a fictional device to explore political philosophy. But here's what troubles me about that dismissal. Plato was specific. He gave dates. He described geography. He detailed architectural features, social structures, and military capabilities. These aren't the hallmarks of allegory. These are the details of someone reporting historical information, however imperfectly transmitted across thousands of years. And there's something else. 9,000 years before Plato places us at approximately 9,600 BC, or 11,600 years ago from today. That date should sound familiar. It's the precise moment when the Younger Dryas period ended, when global temperatures suddenly rose, when massive ice sheets covering North America and Northern Europe began their catastrophic collapse, releasing unimaginable volumes of water into the world's oceans. The date Plato gives us for the destruction of Atlantis aligns exactly with the greatest episode of sea level rise in human history. This wasn't gradual, this wasn't gentle. Between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, sea levels rose by more than 400 feet. Vast coastal regions where humans had lived for millennia were drowned. Islands became underwater mountains. Harbors became abyssal plains. Entire landscapes, entire ecosystems, entire human worlds were swallowed by the advancing tide. If there had been a maritime civilization during the Ice Age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today, it would have been obliterated. Its ports, its cities, its monuments, all would now lie beneath 300 feet of water and thousands of years of accumulated sediment. This is the context mainstream archaeology prefers to ignore. We're told that before 11,000 years ago, humans were simple hunter-gatherers. No cities, no architecture, no seafaring, no complex societies, just small bands of nomads following game animals and gathering wild plants. And then, suddenly, mysteriously, everything changes. Agriculture appears simultaneously in multiple locations around the world. Monumental architecture springs up fully formed at sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9,600 BC, contemporary with Plato's Atlantis. Sophisticated astronomical knowledge appears in cultures separated by oceans. Mathematical relationships encoded in ancient structures show understanding that shouldn't exist for thousands of years. But what if we have the story backwards? What if these sudden developments weren't independent innovations by hunter-gatherers, but the transmission of knowledge from survivors of a catastrophe? What if Atlantis, or whatever we choose to call that lost civilization, wasn't mythological but real, and its destruction seeded the emergence of what we call civilization across the globe? Consider the evidence for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Beginning around 2007, a team of scientists proposed that the sudden cooling event that triggered the Younger Dryas was caused by the impact of a fragmented comet. The evidence is compelling and growing. Across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, researchers have found a distinct boundary layer dated to 12,800 years ago, containing extraordinary markers, nanodiamonds, which only form under the extreme temperatures and pressures of cosmic impact, microscopic spherules of molten rock, platinum anomalies, and widespread evidence of massive wildfires. In 2018, researchers even located what appears to be a 31-kilometer-wide impact crater beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in Greenland, dating to the exact period we're discussing. The implications are staggering. A fragmented comet strike would have triggered immediate and catastrophic climate change. Massive wildfires would have swept across continents. Tsunamis hundreds of feet high would have devastated coastlines. The impact winter that followed would have plunged the world into more than 1,000 years of cold, fundamentally disrupting ecosystems and driving the extinction of dozens of species of megafauna: mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and humans. How many humans died in that catastrophe? How many coastal civilizations, if they existed, were obliterated? Now here's where it gets interesting. Cultures around the world preserve traditions of a great flood that destroyed an earlier world. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim, the only man who survived the deluge sent by the gods, building a boat to save himself, his family, and pairs of every living creature. In the Hebrew Bible, we have the story of Noah and the Ark. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu about an impending flood. In South America, the Mapuche people speak of a battle between the serpent Trentrenvilu and Kaikaivilu that caused massive flooding. In China, ancient texts describe Gunyu taming the floods. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a deluge sent by Zeus. These aren't isolated stories. They're global. Mainstream archaeology dismisses these accounts as independent mythological responses to local flooding events, perhaps seasonal river floods that seemed apocalyptic to ancient peoples. But this explanation requires us to believe in an extraordinary coincidence that cultures separated by oceans with no contact all independently created remarkably similar stories about a world-destroying flood, survivors in boats, and the renewal of humanity. Or we can consider the alternative, that these stories preserve a real memory of a real event that affected the entire world, the catastrophic sea level rise at the end of the Younger Dryas. What does this have to do with Atlantis? Everything. If Plato's account preserves even a fragment of historical truth, then Atlantis was a casualty of this global catastrophe. The Egyptian priests who told Solon about Atlantis would have been transmitting oral traditions stretching back more than 7,000 years, an extraordinary feat of cultural memory, but not impossible. We know from other examples that oral traditions can preserve accurate information across millennia. Australian Aboriginal stories describe coastal landscapes that were inundated by rising seas more than 7,000 years ago, and when archaeologists investigated, they found the stories were accurate. But here's what mainstream archaeology finds very hard to accept. If Atlantis or any Ice Age civilization actually existed, where are the ruins? This is a fair question, but it presumes that we've looked in the right places. We haven't. Less than 5% of the ocean floor has been mapped in detail. Underwater surveys have revealed tantalizing structures off the coasts of Japan, India, and the Mediterranean, like the Yonaguni Formation with its carved steps and platforms, or ruins in the Gulf of Comet, dated to 9,500 years old. These findings remain controversial, but they're exactly what we'd expect to find if coastal civilizations were drowned by rising seas. But the most compelling evidence comes from sites on land that somehow survived the Cataclysm. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9,600 BC, shouldn't exist according to the conventional timeline of human development. Its massive stone pillars, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals and geometric symbols, were erected by people we're told were simple hunter-gatherers. The site represents a level of organization, planning, and artistic sophistication that challenges everything we thought we knew about the capabilities of humans at that time. Some researchers have suggested that Göbekli Tepe may encode astronomical information, perhaps even a record of the comet strike that triggered the Younger Dryas. Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Stone, appears to depict celestial objects and symbols that match the position of certain constellations around 10,050 BC, right in the middle of the Younger Dryas period. This is where the pieces start to fit together. What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't built by hunter-gatherers spontaneously discovering monumental architecture? What if it was built by survivors of a more advanced civilization, people who knew what was coming or what had just happened, deliberately creating a time capsule of knowledge encoded in stone? The site was eventually buried, carefully, deliberately covered with earth, as if it was being preserved for future generations to discover. Why would hunter-gatherers do this? If you're starting to see the pattern, if the pieces are clicking together for you, make sure you're subscribed. We're just beginning to uncover what really happened 11,000 years ago. Don't miss what comes next. The same pattern appears elsewhere. In Egypt, we find the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, monuments that show levels of precision and astronomical alignment that seem anachronistic for their supposed construction dates. The water erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure, analyzed by geologist Robert Schoch, suggest it's far older than mainstream Egyptology accepts, possibly dating to a time when the Giza Plateau experienced heavy rainfall, before 7,000 BC. In South America, megalithic sites like Tiahuanaco in Bolivia feature massive stone blocks, fitted together with precision that remains difficult to replicate today, raising questions about the true age and purpose of these structures. And then there's the knowledge itself. Mathematical constants like pi and the golden ratio appear in ancient structures around the world. The number 72 and its multiples encode the rate of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes star positions to shift over millennia. This isn't simple observation. This is sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics that allegedly primitive peoples shouldn't possess. Here's what I think happened. 11,600 years ago, the world was very different. Sea levels were lower. Vast continental shelves that are now underwater were inhabitable land. On these coastal plains, over thousands of years, a maritime civilization developed, perhaps not globally unified like Plato's Atlantis, but interconnected through seafaring, sharing knowledge, technology, and cultural practices. Then came the catastrophe. The comet strike, the fires, the flood. Within a generation, perhaps within years, most of this civilization was destroyed. Coastal settlements drowned, populations were decimated. The survivors, scattered refugees, carried what knowledge they could to inland regions, to highland areas, to places that might survive the chaos. These survivors became the civilizing heroes that appear in myths worldwide: Viracocha in Peru, Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, Osiris in Egypt, Oannes in Sumer, figures described as coming from across the sea, bringing knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. Not gods, but men and women from a vanished world, trying desperately to preserve their civilization by teaching anyone who would listen. Some succeeded. Some of their knowledge survived, encoded in monuments, in myths, in oral traditions that would be passed down for thousands of years until the rise of writing allowed them to be recorded. This explains so many mysteries that conventional archaeology struggles with. It explains the sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple locations. It explains the astronomical sophistication of ancient cultures. It explains the global distribution of flood myths. It explains why megalithic sites around the world share similar architectural techniques and astronomical alignments. And it explains Plato's Atlantis, not as a moral fable, but as a fragmentary memory of a real catastrophe, transmitted through Egyptian priests who had preserved traditions reaching back to the time before the flood. But mainstream archaeology resists this interpretation. We're told there's no evidence, that we're confusing correlation with causation, that we're seeing patterns where none exist. We're told that Atlantis is fantasy and that flood myths are just myths. But I think they're memories. I think they're real memories of something terrible that happened to our ancestors at the end of the last ice age. Memories preserved in legends, in art, and in stone. The evidence is there if we're willing to look. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis continues to gain scientific support. Underwater archaeology is just beginning to explore the drowned coastlines where Ice Age civilizations would have existed. New dating techniques are revealing that many ancient sites are far older than previously thought. And every year, discoveries challenge the comfortable narrative that civilization began in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago, and that before that, humans were incapable of complex thought or organization. We are a species with amnesia. We've forgotten a vital part of our own story. The fog that surrounds our prehistory isn't natural. It's the result of a catastrophe so devastating that it nearly wiped us out. Atlantis, whatever it was, whatever we choose to call it, represents that forgotten world. And the flood that destroyed it wasn't divine punishment for hubris. It was geology. It was astronomy. It was the consequence of a fragmented comet striking Earth at the worst possible moment in our development. Standing on the shore today, watching waves roll in, it's almost impossible to imagine this coastline 400 feet lower, the sea miles farther out, entire landscapes now underwater. But that world existed. People lived there. They built. They loved. They created. And then, the waters rose, and everything they were vanished beneath the tide. Only fragments remain, myths that seem too similar to be coincidence, monuments that seem too sophisticated for their time, knowledge that appears before it should. The question isn't whether Atlantis existed. The question is, what really happened 11,600 years ago? And are we finally ready to remember? If this investigation resonates with you, if you believe we deserve to know our true history, hit that like button. It tells me you want more of these deep dives into our forgotten past. And trust me, we're only scratching the surface. In our next exploration, we journey to Baalbek, where stones heavier than memory itself challenge everything we think we know about ancient builders. There, in the mountains of Lebanon, blocks weighing over 1,000 tons were moved and precisely placed, using techniques that remain unexplained. If the survivors of a global cataclysm possessed knowledge we've forgotten, if they carried the memory of a more advanced age, then the impossible stones of Baalbek may be their signature. Evidence not of alien intervention, but of human capability that we've only just begun to rediscover.